Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me? Everything okay? So wonderful to see so many friendly faces or icons logged on. Good afternoon and welcome to this session where we present our dear colleague, Beatriz Llenín Figueroa's latest publication titled Affect Archive Archipelago, Puerto Rico's Sovereign Caribbean Lives. We have been instructed to speak slowly with pause. There is simultaneous interpretation provided for this session, and so I will turn over the presentation at this point to them so that they can give you further instructions.
Welcome, bienvenidos a todos, and congratulations, Bea and the whole team. Y felicidades a todos, a Bea y a todos el equipo. Mi nombre es Bruje Fuego y estoy aquí con mi colega Anaís. Hi, my name is Bruje Fuego and I'm here with my colleague Anaís, collaborating with Cooperativa Brújulas, colaborando con Cooperativa Brújulas, que somos un marco de justicia de lenguaje y sanación. And we work with the language, the healing language justice framework. Este va a ser un espacio bilingüe. This will be a bilingual space en español e inglés, in Spanish and English. We ask for you to please follow the following instructions to activate your interpretation function in Zoom. Les pedimos que por favor sigan las próximas instrucciones para poder activar su función de interpretación en Zoom. Si usted está usando una computadora, if you're using a computer, please look at the bottom of your screen and find the icon with the shape of a globe. Por favor, encuentre el icono en la forma de un globo en la parte baja de su pantalla de su computadora. Presione allí donde dice interpretación. Press where it says interpretation. There you should see the options of English and Spanish. Ahí usted debe de ver las opciones de inglés o español. Por favor, escoja el lenguaje que usted quiere recibir. Please choose the language that you want to receive. Si usted es bilingüe en español e inglés, no es necesario que usted active la función. If you are fully bilingual in English and Spanish, it is not necessary for you to activate your function. If you're using your phone, please make sure that you click on the three dots at the bottom of your screen on your phone and choose interpretation with the menu drop that it gives you. There you will also see the selection of Spanish and English. Click the language that you want to receive. Ahí mismo, después de presionar los tres puntitos, va a salir un menú donde le va a dar la opción de los dos lenguajes, español e inglés. Escoja el lenguaje con el que usted quiere escuchar. It's really important if you're connecting through your phone to press done. Otherwise, your language activation will not be activated. Si no presiona en finalizar o done en su teléfono, no se va a activar la función. Voy a continuar en español. Honramos las tierras. ¿Me escuchan? Perdón. Honramos las tierras desde donde estamos actualmente en Buriqué, en Puerto Rico, y reconocemos los ancestres, las luchas y las vidas de los pueblos indígenas de Buriqué, en Puerto Rico, y de personas negras, afroindígenas y afrodescendientes que en ellas caminaron y caminamos. Reconocemos el poder de los lenguajes. Entendemos que por una parte, alrededor del mundo y en la región antillana, se han utilizado lenguajes colonizadores como una herramienta para desconectarnos, generar amnesia colectiva, excluir, deshumanizar, controlar, oprimir y generar trauma para expandir la colonización, supremacía blanca, antiindigenista, antinegritud, así mismo como el capitalismo, neoliberalismo y la violencia patriarcal cis heterosexual. Por otra parte, entendemos que los lenguajes también son medicina poderosa y parte del corazón de la sanación, la liberación y descolonización de las tierras en las que caminamos, que nos cuidan y que cuidamos. Y para continuar con el legado de liberación y sanación, el marco de justicia del lenguaje y sanación con que hacemos esta interpretación es el compromiso de todos para interrumpir el trauma y la violencia generacional y asegurar que ningún lenguaje es dominante sobre otro lenguaje, y asegurar que tenemos el derecho de hablarnos, escucharnos y que se nos entienda en el lenguaje con que mejor fluimos desde nuestro corazón. Gracias por activar su función de interpretación y ejercer su derecho y responsabilidad de practicar la justicia del lenguaje y sanación. Si alguien tiene alguna pregunta o necesita apoyo en cómo activar la función de interpretación, escríbanos directamente por el chat. Gracias por su tiempo y esperamos que puedan disfrutar este evento bilingüe. Gracias.
Thank you so much, Anais, for that powerful message on language and healing. My name is Carmen Haydée Rivera. I teach at the University of Puerto Rico, Rio Piedras campus. I am honored this afternoon to accept Dr. Llenín Figueroa's invitation to moderate this presentation. Today, we have a wonderful panel of artists and educators who joined Dr. Llenín Figueroa. Each one will have a 10-minute presentation period preceded by some brief biographical details that I will provide before their interventions. Then Dr. Llenín Figueroa will address the audience for approximately 15 to 20 minutes. Once the presentations are completed, then we will open the space for dialogue between the presenters, the author, and the audience. We begin with our first distinguished presenter, Dr. Opal Palmer Adisa. And I will be providing some very brief comments on her biography, too brief, as we have already said, right? But I will begin by saying that she is a feminist activist and has published 23 collections, over 23 collections that include essays, novels, short stories, poetry collections, and children's books. Her new story poems, The Storyteller's Return, was released in April 2022. She is the editor-in-chief of two major journals, Interviewing the Caribbean, a literary visual medium, and Caribbean Conjunctures, which publishes scholarly essays and book reviews. She was also the former director for the Institute for Gender and Development Studies at the University of the West Indies, Mona. And she is also Professor Emeritus at California College of the Arts, where she taught as a distinguished professor for 23 years. She has lectured and read her work throughout the United States, South Africa, Ghana, Nigeria, Germany, England, and Prague, and has performed in Italy and Bosnia. With you, the incomparable, Opal Palmer Adisa.
Hello, everyone. And I want to say how honored I am that I was asked to participate in this wonderful discourse this afternoon. And I want to thank Carmen for the wonderful introduction. I also want to say what a pleasure it is that we are able to communicate. And I love this notion of language and healing. And so I want to thank you for that. I tend to speak very fast, so I'm going to be working to go slower, and I did set a timer because I don't want to exploit my time. So I'm going to work to go very slowly or slower than so that you can understand. And the title of my presentation is I Am Swimming with You. I want to begin by first thanking Beatriz for this fresh and innovative work that provides other lenses through which to deconstruct the academy and bring into center the work of those who are bent on transforming our society for the betterment of the majority. Affect, Archive, Archipelago, Puerto Rico's Sovereign Caribbean Lives by Beatriz is a welcome addition to looking at our lives from our own perspective, and which gives credence to who and what we are about. While colonialism has attempted to define us as marginal, as less than, in comparison to who they are and the criteria they have established, we know we swim in the sea. And Beatriz reminds of what capable swimmers we are, and that we should never forget that sea and its waters are a part of who we are. And as Mia Motley has also attested, that when we in the Caribbean include the sea as part of our landmass, we realize that we are much larger in size and volume than how we are defined. So Beatriz, thanks for reminding us and making it clear, and I quote, when you begin with waters coming to shore, you have to know that the very history of who you are is the largest and endless entity in the world. And I invite us to pause here and to just take in that whole concept of water coming ashore and being the largest and endless entity in the world. Because that is important for us in the Caribbean, who tend to think of ourselves in comparison to Europe or Asia, that we're small, that enlarges who we are. And in fact, it is part of our history and part of our landmass. The value of this book are numerous, or rather the values of this book are numerous. But for me, what is primary is a vision of a collective consciousness, a united Caribbean, which I not only believe is possible, but which, like Beatriz, I believe is necessary and essential for our holistic survival as a people, as a vision of Caribbean unity. Because again, and I quote from Beatriz, who quotes from many of the Caribbean scholars whose work I endorse, foremost among them, Glissant, who says, the island is an amphitheater with ocean stands, where representation is temptation of the world. And I want to read that again, because again, I think what for me is so magnificent about this collection is the times it causes me to really pause and reflect on what's being said, and then to look at what is being said in terms of the lived reality. So Glissant says, The island is an amphitheater with ocean stands where representation is temptation of the world. And to further the discourse of connectivity and building bridges, we are connected always, even when we are unable to see how and where. But this talk is about sovereignty and being free from the shackles of colonialism. Now, very recently in the news, but it's an old argument that many people have forgotten. And in fact, Beatrice reminds us with those scholars that and activists that she brings forth in chapters 1, 2, and 3, the argument of reparation and disengagement from whatever empire it is, whether it is the Spanish or the British. And right now, there's a lot of credence and a lot of momentum behind reparation, not only because the king has died, the queen has died, and we have a supposedly new king, but because this is a moment in time, you know, and there are various moments in time when a certain synergy builds. And this is a moment in time when people who have been colonized by different regimes are coming together and are throwing off the shackles of colonialism and are fighting for taking us another step. This book is the bridge we have been seeking that can help us to dispel all of the untruths of what is possible and enter the realm of what is not possible, but what others have been laying the foundation for, that we must now build on. Seriously, with steadfast gaze to stay connected and not allow the weapons and manipulations of imperialism and capitalism to sever those ties. So while the focus of this work is on Puerto Rico or Borican, we come away with the rightful understanding that this is about the Caribbean nation and our path and endless struggle for freedom, for independence, for self-government, for sovereignty. What I love especially is how Beatrice talks about her process, that each writing is preceded by a walk, and that the sea that is both stable and unstable sustains and allows for this unfolding and integration of the many muses and inspiration that feeds and nurtures this work. So when she says it feels more like a love letter, I really feel in the reading of this book that this is in fact what she has engaged us in, is that it is a love letter to the Caribbean, about unity, and we are being allowed to imagine as she is imagining and recreating our liberations. So it is only appropriate that she also talks about the dolphin schools, you know, and their organizational structure for learning, nurture, and survival, and importantly for intergenerational, because I think this is what we have lost in the Caribbean in terms of our drive to modernity, is this intergenerational connection, which is talked about. So when we look at the Caribbean and its comparative relationship and how it goes about decolonizing, the sea and the relationship, the various forms and practices of sovereignty has to be envisioned. And this is done in a very important way. So, you know, she gives us 6 steps that when you read, you can then ponder on what these 6 steps mean and how do we in the different lived reality begin to integrate those. What is also important, I think, because the focus of this book is seemingly Caribbean, how do they then engage? Of course, the technologies such as this one that we are using today provides us with much more option, those of us who are not bilingual. And certainly we need to push and I feel very badly in this regard. We need to push and enforce more the multilinguality of the Caribbean so that we can connect and speak with each other in a more pragmatic and realistic way. And certainly that is one of the disciplinary ideological shifts that I think needs to happen for us moving forward in terms of this connectiveness, is understanding that we need to be multilingual and how that multilinguality serves us as a people as we move forward. There's so much I want to talk about, but one of the things that I certainly want us to look at is the whole issue of power and how power has been presented to us, and also how we have, in a sense, accepted certain marginality. And I never liked that word, and I think it's important that we begin to see ourselves as center, which is what I think is the part of the thrust of this collection, moving us from margin to center and understanding that our experience of being a part of the new world, wherever we've been brought from, and our relationship to the indigenous people, which we must not forget, that we are center, and that the sea, which connects all of us, whether on top or underground, is an important linkage that we need to understand and respect. And it's part of the question of sovereignty. It's part of the way in which we imagine ourselves. It is part of the experimentation of development that we are enacting. So that for me is a very important part of the text. And I also want to give thanks really to the chapters on these three very Luisa Capatello, and again, my Spanish is terrible, but I was not aware of these persons. And there's so many historical figures throughout the Caribbean, whether it's the Anglophone Caribbean or the Spanish Caribbean or the Francophone Caribbean, that we are not aware of. And part of what this is giving us this base of strength for which to stand on. Because the more we know about those people who came before us, who have laid the foundation on which we need to then walk to build, then the better off we are. And so this is also one of the important features of this book. So in finding out, and I was very excited to find out about the journalist Luisa, who projects her view by addressing generations and alternative lifestyle, because one of the issues also for us is when we talk about reparation, when we talk about dismantling or breaking the chains from the empire, whatever that empire is, we have to begin to reimagine alternative lifestyles in all of the ways that we are. And of course, because food sovereignty and the ecology, the environment are such big topics these days and which impact us, and certainly Puerto Rico, last year or the year before and this year again has been impacted by hurricanes, and what hurricanes are now doing, right? And looking at the whole hurricane, the origin of the word and what that means, it forces us to begin to look at how do we manage these natural so-called disasters. Some people say they're disasters, but some people might also say that they're rebalancing for all of the damage that we're doing, for all of the damage that has been done to these land masses. It might be a way of rebalancing, because I don't know about you, but I certainly believe that Mother Nature, the earth as we know it, is far superior and stronger and brighter than we are. And so even though we will attempt, and we've done a lot to damage it, it will always win. And that's an important thing. So we have to begin to imagine alternative lifestyles and to look at what are the political forces, both the patriarchal and the capitalist forces, that have kept us in this condition of second citizen or non-citizenship, and how do we forge ahead to make this our own home. So one of the quotes that I want to read from the book, because I thought it was so important, is where it says, all of those who judge an idea put in principles must be pushed aside. They hinder great initiatives, good work. Despite that, they call themselves patriots and father of the old homeland. What concept of homeland do we have? And again, I want us to pause to think about that. What concept of homeland do we have? And when we think of development and moving into the future, are we looking at that through the lens of the Caribbean and what is native and indigenous to us? Or are we looking at that through the lens of the primarily foreign intervention that has been part of our life so far, right? So that's an important thing for us to look at as we move forward in terms of how do we build how do we build bridges? So Pedro Campos and the Partido Nacionalista, again, another, and I want to thank Beatriz because again, I was not aware of these foundational leaders who were working towards transformation, you know, and this is why I say it's important that we have a solid base and we understand who are the people who have come before us, on whose shoulders we stand without even being aware that we stand on their shoulders. And this is part of what we get in here. So the idea of reclaiming our spirit, reclaiming our gods, reclaiming what is indigenous to us and not demonizing it, removing the demonicness that has happened to who we are. And so it was important to read the letters. And again, letters are so important, you know, for a very long time, letters were considered to be the purveyor, one of the writing purveyors of women. And we don't write letters anymore. Emails don't really qualify as letters. I imagine that they could qualify, but in a sense, they really don't qualify. So for me, reading the words of these foundational fathers were so important, and mothers were so important to this whole process of development. So Beatriz, I'm coming up close to my time. What I want to say that this is tremendous work on many levels because of the integration of scholars and literary forefathers and foremothers that you've brought into the text, because of the way in which you have integrated your process and the way in which the sea that surrounds all of us, that nurtures, that lifts, that can also rock all of us, is part of the integration that we're swimming in this wave, but also that you engage us in reimagining and reflecting and understanding and knowing that there were those before us who fought the good fight and who set a foundation from which we can then build and grow from. And so I'm very grateful to you. I'm very grateful for this text. I really love all of it, but I really love the first section of, you know, the way in which the creative process as a writer, then certainly your creative process, your way of understanding the way in which the academy can bring a kind of, I want to say artificial, but brings a kind of language that not make things as discernible and as readable as they should. And you have broken through that. You have given us scholarship and research, but you've also given us and presented it in a way that is easy, that is like mango. That is like mango. And so I want to thank you, and I think my time is up.
Thank you so much, Opal, for those inspiring and motivational comments. I'm sure we'll have a lot to say in the Q&A session as we come up later. Thank you so much. Our next presenter is Dr. Maritza Stanchich, a professor of English at the University of Puerto Rico, Rio Piedras, my dear colleague and friend. Her essays on Faulkner, Puerto Rican diaspora literature, and crises in Puerto Rico have been published in peer-reviewed journals and books. In 2020, she and co-author Hilda Llorens won the LASA Puerto Rico section of the Blanca G. Silvestrini Prize for Outstanding Article in Puerto Rican Studies. Her columns for Huffington Post, the New York Times, and The Guardian helped bring international attention to Puerto Rico's crisis. A longtime activist, she has also worked for academic unionization in California and in Puerto Rico. Raised in New Jersey, of Croatian and Peruvian descent, she has worked in Puerto Rico for 25 years. Maritza.
Thank you. Thank you for this invitation. I'm honored to be here. It was wonderful also to listen to Opal Palmer Adisa's poetic take on this work. Mine is decidedly less poetic, though I have been writing poetry lately. I formulated my presentation in a series of questions that the text immediately provoked for me. So I'll share these with you now, speaking slowly for the simultaneous translators. Interpreters. I noticed faces here from have to say this, from the graduate program of the English department at the University of Puerto Rico's College of Humanities in Rio Piedras, and also recognize friendly faces, colleagues, and it's great to see. Thank you very much, everybody, for being here. I'm really grateful for this opportunity to dialogue with fellow invited guests, as well as the author and as well as the audience. I'd like to start off with a series of questions that my reading of Beatriz Llenín Figueroa's important book, Affect Archipelago, Puerto Rico's Sovereign Caribbean Lives, published this year, immediately provoked, any of which are an invitation for further discussion. The first, how does this hybrid text recuperate and reinvigorate living traditions of dissent as part of Puerto Rican and Caribbean intellectual history? And I start here and I end here, and obviously it's a very broad question. But when I wrote this question, I thought of books like, which she cited, like Silvio Torres Ceilant's 2006, kind of tome of Caribbean intellectual history, and wondered where this would fit in, or where some of the figures that she writes about here would fit in. What is the effect of theorizing the global Caribbean luminary Edouard Glissant in tandem with the proudly described local prodigious literary production of Marta Aponte Alsina in a study published in English? Especially since recently the author, well, the luminary has passed away, so I think globally his oeuvre is still of, it's an oeuvre that has exceeded Caribbean studies and for decades, and is very often invoked in global studies of globalization, and bringing. So I would actually venture to stretch the archipelago in other ways I could mention, say Vieques and Okinawa, and the very important, prolific oeuvre of Marta Aponte Alsina. I think that alone is a move worth thinking about and chewing. For example, since a translation of Luisa Capetillo, so for example, in terms of publishing this in English, and also, of course, I think this speaks to the important efforts of presenting this book launch in simultaneous interpretation. For example, since a translation of Luisa Capetillo was published by Arte Público, a major translation of her most important book, Mi Opinión, was published by Arte Público Press in 2004, Penguin Books has republished a more popular version in 2021. I think that is really important. And I think that the fact that she's writing about, in this book, Luisa Capetillo and Betances, and using an enormous contribution of Felix Ojeda in Betances' scholarship, along with Pedro Albizu Campos. What are the debalkanizing implications for Caribbean studies, as well as for broader theorizing and engagement with Puerto Rican and Caribbean diasporas? This book can't do everything, and I think that it's the task of the whole Caribbean, and it's impossible to imagine Caribbean studies and Caribbean theory without diasporas. It's hard to imagine any of it. Negritude in part happened in Paris, Frantz Fanon in part happened in Paris and Algeria. So the diasporas always, so the diasporas and the history of the diasporas are always part of this conversation. What are the balkanizing implications for Caribbean studies, as well as for broader theorizing and engagement with Puerto Rican and Caribbean diasporas? So I would say that in terms of studies and disciplines, but also in terms of the current state of affairs. What are the potential pitfalls of these rich opportunities? And I suppose even by mentioning Glissant as a theorist in globalization studies, we could already see some of those pitfalls, but there might be ones I'm not seeing or thinking of. In its deployment of ample citational and bibliographical academic prose, with interviews and effective, at times sentimental, creative reveries and autoethnography, I would characterize Llenin's scholarly study as a hybrid text. What other, so it's clearly academic, but it's also a hybrid. In a way, it spoke to me directly to Luisa Capetillo's style, which she writes about in the book. I have characterized what others might it work well in dialogue with at this time. And what comes to mind is it cites the dissertation of Melissa Rosario, which I believe and hope will be a forthcoming text publication with Northwestern University Press. It makes me think a little bit too of the recent award of Puerto Rican Studies Association to Hilda Llorens's book, Making Livable Worlds, which is anthropology, but I think also hybrid in terms of autoethnography. It made me think a little bit beyond Puerto Rico of earlier works by Miriam J.A. Chauncey, Searching for Safe Spaces and Framing Silence. But it might be really interesting specifically to put this work in dialogue with other hybrid texts of this nature in this Caribbean context. And I think we might be seeing more of that, and I think that's worth observing. An important conclusive point that this book ends on is that part 2, featuring, and I'm quoting, communitarian artistic bodily sovereignties, is not predicated on part 1 as heroic revolutionary meta-narratives. So it's so important to get to the end of this book, and all books, and of course all of us are constantly challenged by the limits of doing that. But here, I think this was very important in part of the book. How does the second part of the book dialogically engage the first part? I use the word dialogically on purpose. How might each of the major figures of part 1 dialogically speak to each other? Within part 2, the same could be asked of Teresa Hernandez's art and interviews with those of Amigas Exes del Mar. And the same could be asked of the visuals in the book. I didn't want to leave them out, and I only include them this way, but worth discussing on their own. What are the limits, and within this, what are the limits and contours of the nation state as a site of contradiction and struggle in the critique in this book? And I think this book is wrestling with that, and it cites, I think, aptly, Buenaventura Susos Santos, who is a scholar, I think keeps alive the notion of the nation state as a site of struggle and contradiction. And of course, especially perhaps Luisa Capetillo's anarchist works points to how the state is been co-opted by capitalism and is used to repress communities, even specifically, very specifically. So I think this is a really important question that this book is grappling with. what are the challenges of historicizing the present as well as the past? And by present, I mean the past 20 or 50 years. So one of the things that I think is really important in terms of part 1 and part 2 of the book is that part 2 takes us into the living crisis of the past 20 years and into practices of dissent and art of the past 20 years. And of course, the earlier figures are from the turn of the century and the early 20th century. So I think because the crisis is so dizzying and acute and chronic, it is very challenging as an intellectual and perhaps also as an artist. I think certainly so. I think Teresa Hernandez speaks to that. And so I think that's something else the book is doing. My next question. I'm finishing. What are the roles of and I purposely use this as plural. What are the roles of humanities and social sciences intellectuals in Puerto Rico in today's climate of dizzying precarity? Dr. Llenín is in process with this book as a public intellectual in Spanish and English in online, local, and broader print media. So, yeah, I should in local and broader print media and online media, and in publishing journals and within the press of ediciones emergentes from Cabo Rojo, that is regionally outside the metropolitan area, and in times of a post. I don't want to say I'm throwing in the towel, but let's I think call it what it is, a post-tenure academy. I think we're all engaged in this struggle, but I think we've gotten to the point where 70% of the academy in the United States is adjuncts and 40% at least at UPR. How is this author giving us one example of that we can use to answer this question, or to think about this question about what are the roles of the humanities and social science intellectuals in Puerto Rico today? Finally, what is the state of dissent today in Puerto Rico and in the region? In considering, I would say every single key figure and artistic movement and artistic collective that is examined in the book are performing dissent. What is the state of dissent in Puerto Rico and the region? I think that's perhaps another important relationship between part 1 and part 2 of the book. In considering the triple A's of the title and in their order, because affect, archive, and archipelago. I actually thought, well, archipelago, it's not alphabetical. It's not in alphabetical order. So in considering the triple A's of the title, affect, archive, and archipelago, what are the stakes of documenting, participating, and collaborating with intellectual, political, artistic dissent as living traditions? And I think that the book itself is a performance. The book itself is a performance. And so I just kind of want to ask these broad questions for the sake of discussion. I'm going to conclude by congratulating her for putting this text into the world as a permanent record, while it is provoking all these questions and many more. And I'll end my humble contribution with that. Thank you so much, and looking forward to our conversation.
Thank you very much, Maritza. These were, again, thought-provoking questions you provided along with Opal's comments. I'm writing like crazy, trying to keep up so we can come back to these just really wonderful comments in the Q&A. I do want to just briefly and very quickly, following Maritza's acknowledgement of some of the people in the audience, I do just want to give a brief shout out quickly to Dr. Lowell Feet, who I see is connected, one of the founding figures of our doctoral program at the University of Puerto Rico, and also to Dr. Patrick Andre Mather, our coordinator, graduate coordinator of the graduate program here. And also to Lisette, Dr. Lisette Rolón Collazo, a friend, comrade, also co-editor of Editorial Educación Emergente and University professor, University of Puerto Rico professor in Mayagüez. Saludos. And many others that we will get to, I promise, by the end of the presentation. Just wanted to kind of give a brief shout out to these wonderful people. Our next presenter is Dr. Ian Anthony Bethell Bennett. He is a Caribbean-based academic who holds degrees in cultural studies, international trade policy, in English and in Spanish, and has taught at the University of Puerto Rico, Brandeis University, and the University of the Bahamas. His research includes gender and development studies, how gender should inform policy and how it impacts national development, as well as post-colonial literature and culture. He has published on sustainable development, tourism, gender conflicts, and violence, among other areas. He is also an active photographer. Tony.
Muchas gracias, Carmen. Thank you very much. I wanted to title my piece, How Place Feels, How I Feel Place, because of the evocative nature that Beatriz brings us with place. We are placed and we feel placed in the book, especially for me in Escambrón and in Old San Juan. I mean, those two descriptions were amazingly poignant with the performances on the coast and the way they were integrated into the text. I want to start off with a quote from the end of the book. So much effective remembering to do here in this small place, forsaken by history. So much archiving, honoring we owe. Our true debt, one we can never repay, but try we must. End quote. Where the land meets my body, where the sea washes my soul, I am enveloped in affect, archive, and archipelago, or archipelago. And all waters are touching each other. And this brings to mind Benitez Rojos, the repeating island, and the way that the sea washes memories in and out. My focus and my brief presentation, because I really wanted to make people think about this, is how land or place and space works into this discussion, because Beatriz really comes into that at the end or the second part of the book, but it is addressed in the beginning of the book, because so much of it is about evoking place and invoking place, and how place becomes developed through the centuries. I am using one of the ideas. This is my island in the sun that washes along the sea, and perhaps other chains of representation. So it challenges the way we are represented, even though it is an island, and the island in the sun changes from Puerto Rico to Grand Bahama, to New Providence, to Anguilla, and how we remember things. So one of the challenges I have for the text is that how do we create spaces when we're constantly under the threat of erasure? And that was something that really became clear to me in the last, I think it was in chapter 5, when we were performing theater. And theater is such a powerful vehicle for self-expression, not just about the poetics of life, but about the experiences without them feeling threatening in so many ways. Because like Bad Bunny, the music allows us, the performance allows us to free ourselves, and that brings other people with us without them feeling in any way threatened, as came out so clearly in the text. So the decolonial flows of Sargasso, but the climatic change of over Sargassoed seas and the rising sea levels that torture us and the hurricanes that pound us, how we perform our lives within these spaces really important, because we have been, Opal brought this up at the beginning, we've been colonized into thinking in particular ways about our geography, but our geography is much more important and more expansive than the actual geographical landmass that we have been delimited to. As we break through those limits, we can actually free our creativity. And that's something that Beatriz really brings home to me in so many places and moments in the text. The performance in the plaza in Old San Juan was one of those moments, because plazas are so important, and I'm talking spatially. The spatiality of culture is where we experience so much, and it's just very simple. On a daily basis, you go into the plaza, you have un café, te sientas ahí a hablar, a charlar con la gente, o sencillamente te sientas ahí a ver la gente pasar. Todos los días pasa la misma persona a la misma hora y el ritmo de la vida. We're losing those public spaces because of the way we are being enclosed and corralled into seas of poisoned by toxic waste, seas contaminated by shipping accidents, seas destroyed by hurricane-damaged oil refineries, all of which have been silenced by the lack of performativity of the nation state, or even the neoliberal confabulations, something I presented on earlier this week, of resilience and recovery. This text really brings home the need to have much more Pueblo-based theater, much more Pueblo-based arts. And I love that, because public art is such an essential part of the communication process, but also the healing process. We keep talking about healing, the language of healing. Without public art and the art that includes the public, it is lost, because that healing does not happen. So one of the challenges I'm finding here is that the text articulates or challenges slightly the violence we are living daily, but it doesn't interrogate that. Now, no text can do everything. And that is something where I want to go in my questioning. How do we perform or overperform, overwrite this violence and come at it so that we can actually begin to heal from it? Because the violence of the colonial process and the neo-colonial process is becoming so wrapped in our DNA, or wrapped around our DNA and through our beings, that we are losing ourselves to the violence of erasure. Land is being taken from us as we stand on it. We are being mowed down by bulldozers that change monuments. So Orlando Patterson has this book, The Absence of Monuments. If we are no longer here, what happens to the places we inhabit? And these are questions that come for the Bahamas on the wake of Hurricane Dorian, and also on the wake of Hurricane Irma, because Irma basically erased one island community. And much like Maria in Puerto Rico and the subsequent after effects, what I call the after death is more profound than what actually is talked about after the storm. The impact that this affect, archive, and archipelago has is to liberate our stories and to liberate our souls in ways that grapple with the geopolitical fences and transnational neoliberalization, corporatization of our bodies and our minds, because that's what it is. It is a violence that erodes our nationalism, our creativity, our gendered identities, our spatial identities, and our corporal understanding of who we are as people. And this, I want to bring it back to what Opal was saying at the beginning when she talked about creating identities and creating spaces. And then what Maritza was talking about in terms of the nation. The nation has sold out to the highest or the lowest bidder, both at the same time and in different ways. That has undermined our ability to be in any supported way. We have become erased by our own understanding or lack of understanding of our education, our ability to read, and our ability to communicate across generations. And this, I think, is the tragedy of the 21st century Caribbean reality, is that we have lost so much by what we have been taught is development and progress. And I know this sounds a little alarmist, but I think it's a reality that we really need to look at the fiber of this text and understand the text is saying it's creating emotional spaces for us to be new, but also to renew our old selves, to look at ourselves in new ways, and understand that we can no longer be the 20th century self. We have to be new 21st century beings who are aware of the fundamental erasures of geopolitics and the need to challenge power with decolonial thinking. The coloniality of space, place, and power is really important, and I think that came through in the text in fantastic ways, Beatrice. Thank you for just bringing the whole gendered readings without hitting anyone with the gender pole, because I think sometimes we lose sight of the real confluences of gendered identities because we become, I don't want to say dogmatic, but we become challenging to the ways individuals perform their gendered identities. And that prevents us, as other older people articulated, that prevents us from being our best selves and living our best lives. And not in the neoliberal sense of all for me, but in the very communal sense of all for the community and for not just surviving, but thriving in the space of hurricanes, natural disasters, tornadoes, and the politics of the post-nationalist space that has become really, really hemmed in by decolonial violence and colonial undermining. So thank you for that. How do we move forward? Where do we go? How do we perform ourselves out of this erasure and coastal erosion? And I use coastal erosion with multiple meanings, as in it is not just about the weather impact. It is also about the condominiums that are coming up on the coast that take over the coast and remove it from us. The more the walls go up, the higher la marea viene, y the destruction becomes obsolete, makes everything else obsolete. The challenge that we have then is that if Escambron were not there, how would our communities relate to the sea? The sea that is so important to us, the sea that we can walk to, through, by, down Escambron. And I'm just using Escambron as a metaphor for a much wider relationship I think in Puerto Rico, the beaches are still pretty accessible. In other places, they are not. So that relationship that is still very fundamental to the community is really pivotal in the second half of the text, but also when Betances goes off and when Capatia is moving through the gender fluidity and the gender deconstruction, it is the challenging of spatial markers that is fundamental to a Caribbean identity that flows across the archipelago. And it's not just a single identity, it is a multiple identity that allows us to be Creole or hybrid or simply multiply placed. If I had not lived in Puerto Rico for as long as I did, I would not feel the same way. If I had not lived in Barbados or the Bahamas, the relationship with place and space would be different. La Plaza del Mercado de Río Piedras o de Santurce forma parte de la identidad de la persona y también de la comunidad. So the collective memory, the collective identity rests very, very profoundly in this text. How do we keep collective memory, the collective identity, and the collective culture alive in the space of such coastal erosion? Thank you so much.
Thank you, Tony. I think you brought a really photographic lens to focus on some of the really important issues that Beatriz is bringing up in this publication. Thank you so much to the three of you for your generous and effective reading of her work. And I'm sure we'll have a lot to say about it also. But now we have the most important person here today, Dr. Beatriz Llenín Figueroa, a dear companion, comrade, friend, a self-described nerd, writer, editor, translator, her words, a walker, an animal in live arts apprentice. Having completed a PhD in literature at Duke University, she worked as adjunct professor at the University of Puerto Rico in both the Rio Piedras and the Mayagüez campuses for almost a decade. Currently, she is an independent writer and scholar who stands for Puerto Rican and Caribbean emancipations. Her creative, intellectual, and political lives revolve around the relationships between Puerto Rico and Caribbean archipelagos, islands, seas, and coasts. Experimental and street theater and performance, and multiple embodied forms of sovereignty. Some of her creative writing was published in the collection Puerto Islas, Crónicas, Crisis, Amor by Editora Educación Emergente in 2018, while her most recent book that we are presenting today was published by Rowman and Littlefield in 2022. She is a regular columnist for the Puerto Rican newspaper Claridad, and she works as associate editor for the small independent Puerto Rican press, Editora Educación Emergente, and she is also a freelance editor and translator. Querida Beatriz, the floor is yours.
Gracias, Carmen Haydée. Thank you. I have something that I would like to read and start with, and then maybe devote a few minutes to try to respond. I was also taking notes frantically to these amazing and generous presentations for which I am forever grateful. The call. The island presumes other islands, Antilles. The giant call of the Earth's horizon is unknown to us. We could not wander without end to the ever withdrawn limits, but we forage. Our role will be to convene, The island is an amphitheater with ocean stands, where representation is temptation of the world. This is from Edouard Glissant's Poetic Intention, and Opal quoted this as well in her presentation. So I think it is worth repeating, because I feel after listening to Opal that indeed this quote specifically from Glissant convenes us here. I'm just going to repeat the last two sentences. Our role will be to convene. The island is an amphitheater with ocean stands, where representation is temptation of the world. How to fall into temptation, that is to say, how to touch and let ourselves be touched by, from, and for the other islands presumed by mine and yours. On clear days, we can see our silhouettes elevated above the surface, a miracle. Such proximity, an invitation to grace us with corals, to salt us in mutual preservation. I aspire to read for the horizon, but the master has raised walls on the water, and they blind us. Wandering on the sand, land, I open my flesh with our amphitheater's injection. Edward, Marta, Ramon, Luisa, Pedro, Hilda, Vanessa, Teresa, and all beloveds, I convene and let myself be convened. Frente a un paisaje costero, como ver aparecer las abejas y derramar la miel al mismo tiempo, la boca puede lograr condensación salina, ser mina en multiplicación, desmesura. Mi cuerpo camina con olor a cueva, río, calizas y mar. Elizabeth Magali Robles. Bring down the imperial wall with a kitchen knife, held by the smallness of a mouth-body island that does nothing else but walk on the sands, smelling of cave, river, limestone, and sea, but tidal, non-human becoming art, but fierce beach defending, but healing sea embracing, which is the same as saying that does it all, which is the same as saying that survives in spite of it all, which is the same as saying that opens passages through which we, the islands, touch each other. Like a spider in its oh so subtle exercise of making itself a home from which hang drops of morning dew, presuming the ocean, and within which there will never, ever be a wall or an empire to speak of. This text that I just read, entitled The Call, is Affect Archive Archipelago's poetic opening, at least it tries to be, which I do not think of as distinct from its more scholarly opening in the prelude. With the call, we convene here today in this moment. Thank you always seems so little, and yet thank you. Thank you, Opal, Tony, Maritza, Carmen Haydée, who so generously accepted my invitation to come together for this event and respond to the book from your diverse, multiply spaced, standpoints. A special thank you to Maritza, who also made possible the support of the English department at the University of Puerto Rico, Rio Piedras campus for today's event. Thanks to everyone at the English department, and especially to its graduate coordinator, Patrick Andre Mather, whom is online too, so thank you. I am also deeply grateful to Bruje, Anaís, and everyone at Cooperativa Brújulas, who do such outstanding and necessary language justice work, and who approach it from a perspective very much attuned to the arguments of this book, that is, as an embodied relational healing practice. This event was originally scheduled for October 1st, but once again, the colonial capitalist climate crisis-induced catastrophe wreaked havoc on our archipelago after the relatively mild Hurricane Fiona made landfall on the country's southwest tip, right where I am reading this from, on September 20th. We must overcome again, although we know very well that we should not, must not live like this. Affect Archive Archipelago is made of such overcomings of the historical and contemporary evidence of our dogged love, imagination, daring. We meet online today, right after last week's Global Week of Action for Justice and Debt Cancellation, of which I aspire this book and this event to be a part of, and 10 days after October 12th, Day of Indigenous, Black, and Popular Resistance, Día de la Resistencia Indígena, Negra y Popular, throughout Latin America and the Caribbean. Such mundo otro is our world. It is here, it is us, our passions and our fears, our smells and our words, our ideas and our touch, our desires and our glances. It is us, all our animalia. It is Andre the dog and Clara the cat. We are life in a regime of death, life. Dedicated to lives and love submerged, breathing in our midst, this book, which is many books, and one of those things that we do without knowing whether anyone wants it, needs it, mutated, chameleonic, astú, sancocho, caribeñísimo, during the 10 years of research, writing, tejemenejes, comings and goings, tequeteques, talking and talking, encounters, forms of awe, epiphanies, confusions, and distances that initiated in 2011 in Durham, North Carolina, as an attempt, and I want to add the cliched adjective here, as a desperate attempt at coming up with a way back home to our islands, to which I always knew I would return, but oh, how difficult the regime makes it for us. To great extent, the book was indeed the way. Its effective archive of Caribbean relations has saved me from outright despair, proving that we have always invented our sovereignties, that these are archipelagic, Caribbeanist, and embodied, and that they are here, breathing in our midst, without waiting for any politiquero organism's benediction. I ended up writing the book in English because I have always wanted for this creature the possibility of it being read and discussed, just as we are doing now, with a wider regional audience, and especially our sister and brother Anglophone Caribbean, as well as among Puerto Rican and Caribbean communities beyond our islands who, for well-known historical reasons, do not necessarily read Spanish, a language that is also an invasion, an imperial language. And I say this here as a necessary reminder for sectors in Puerto Rico who are adamant defenders of it against imperial English. But after several years of work, I decided to change course and write it in Spanish before eventually translating it into English myself. So I started doing that. But then a fortuitous encounter in Aruba in 2019, however, sealed the book's destiny to be written first in English and then translated into Spanish, a task that I am working on as we speak. In the end, our islands are interminable translation stories. In Aruba, I met one of the most esteemed scholars of island and archipelago studies, who directed me to Rowman and Littlefield's Rethinking the Island series, of which him, Godfrey Baldacchino, is one of the editors, alongside Elaine Stratford and Elizabeth McMahon. To them, and to Godfrey especially, my sincere gratitude. The regional and international dissemination of a press such as Rowman and Littlefield is simply impossible to match writing from Puerto Rico, a colony ruinated by design. For that, I am also deeply grateful and would like to make a special mention of my generous editor at Rowman and Littlefield, Caitlin Turner. Now that I am no longer amid my University of Puerto Rico students, I reiterate my gratitude to them, and I've seen some of their names here online today. Thank you. for unyieldingly reminding me that our islands are not what the powers that be say they are. I am especially indebted to a group of students who helped me over the years with tasks that ultimately made this book possible. Thank you, Diego Lopez, Maria Fernanda Ortiz, Nachali Sima, Nicole Ruiz, Nicole Talavera, and Paola Gonzalez. For the intensity of her assistance, Paola Egipciaco deserves a word of heartfelt gratitude of her own. And I also want to thank my dear friend and colleague, Christopher Powers, whose name I'm also seeing here, for his invaluable company for so many of the years behind this book, and most especially for reading the drafts, I don't know how many times. Of course, to Lisette, who is the ocean of my life in so many ways, and who has also so generously helped me with the technical aspects of making this Zoom happen today. There are also other people whose names I see here that I would like to express my gratitude for being here, but for also having been around me over the past years. I see Eva Luz Cotto, who is my friend and also an ex-colleague from when I was teaching at the Mayagüez campus in the University of Puerto Rico. I see Kathy Marsh, who's also a dear friend and colleague at Rio Piedras. And Silvia Becerra, who was also my student, and I'm guessing she's getting online from Colombia right now. A special shout out to you. And I think my mom is also online, so another special hi and gratitude to my mother, who's supported me for a long time. And I'm sorry if I missed anyone. I thank you all for being here. Oh, Larry's here. I see your photo. And Maria, hi Larry, thank you so much. And Maria Perez, whom I've met recently, and yeah, she's a cave person, and she's turning me into a cave person. So I'm really grateful for that. I have so many notes from everyone's presentations, but I think the way I'm going to try to respond, I mean, it's a lot, but there are certain concepts or phrases or words that I feel have echoed throughout the three presentations, and that I would just love for us to perhaps take all together as a kind of, I feel like part of what I was trying to do in the book was to say that there are a lot of things going on that have no way of being acknowledged as archival materials, as things that can be documented or archived in the traditional senses that we give to those words, but that nonetheless, and maybe precisely because of that, they are perhaps as important and sometimes even more important than the archivable materials of our loves and our political lives and our dissent, which is a concept that Maritza stressed, and I really wanted to go back to that. And I feel like a lot of what was said by the three of you had to do precisely with such things. The imaginaries was a concept that kept coming up. Dissent, forms of dissent that are just, some of them, especially in their affective dimensions, are really impossible to archive. The idea of space in the way that Tony brings it up, I think is also one of those things that we must all keep returning to, and try to find ways to document them, even if they are undocumentable. The bridges that Opal insisted on, intergenerational relations in general, of all kinds. Maritza posed some pretty amazing questions, and intense and difficult to grapple with. I hope we can have some time to maybe go into at least a couple of them in some detail as soon as I shut up, which will be very soon. Okay, and memory was also something that kept coming up, which is not exactly something that is very archivable in the traditional written sense. Okay, invocation. I'm gonna leave it there. Thanking you all, and indeed trying to make this event also an evocation and an invocation of the Caribbean that we wish, that we are working towards, but I want to insist too of the Caribbean that we have had, that we have made also, in spite of it all. Thank you.
Okay, so I think, I mean, we can react, you know, with this kind of scream clapping hand, or we can go like this, right? For the wonderful presentations of that Beatriz, in her words, that were just delivered. I always, you know, it's so difficult for us who have for so many years been in spaces where we are all together physically, right? So when I say the floor is yours, and then I realize there is no floor, right? This is kind of like a space out there. So how I would have wished that we could have done this in person, right? I think that many of us share that same thought, right? And how much of us, of our own lives have been lived through these islands, right? That we inhabit and that we crisscross when we see each other at conferences and things. But I guess this is the best, you know, next best thing. Thank you so much, Beatriz. It has been a wonderful privilege and honor to present your work that speaks to us in so many ways. And I would just kind of like to open the space for other comments, perhaps the presenters, perhaps saying something in reaction to Beatriz's words, or any of the audience members who has a question or comment that they would like to share.
If I may, yes.
Sure.
So I just want to say I'm so pleased that, you know, there are the three of us, because they're very important issues that have been raised. And Martha talked about the diaspora connection. We cannot talk about the Caribbean without talking about the diaspora connection. And in fact, Beatriz actually raised it. She talked about the negritude movement and the other movements from outside of the metropolis that has influenced, or that is, in a sense, comes from the Caribbean. So I just want to underscore that's an important aspect of what this is all about. And also, you know, because I've just done something on Sylvia Wynter, who is one of our great feminist theorists. And one of the things she says about the novel is that the novel is a dead form, and that it will transform. We will always be writing, but that it will transform. And I'm thinking about that in the context of this word hybridity that we kind of throw around in the Caribbean. And I'm wondering if what we're calling hybridity is not closer to our cosmology, because we as people of color, we as people in the Caribbean, have never operated in this kind of academic divide that the academy has been quartered into. And we're seeing more integration and interconnection you know, and Audre Lorde, of course, talked about the interconnectedness of our lives and our scholarship. And in a sense, Beatriz brings in some of those interconnectedness by the various sources that she uses to build on this theory of connectivity that she's talking about. And then I'm so glad, Tony, for your connection, for your insight, or for your mindfulness about space, and that the threat of the Caribbean is continuous for IMF and all of these other reasons, and also the erosion of our spaces, the erosion of our beaches, not only from the environmental factor, but also because of the erecting of buildings that separate it and keep the masses, you know, as you say, Puerto Rico is a very different situation than Jamaica, where many of the beaches are not open, are not public. And that's one of the things we're fighting for. So, you know, what happens in those places? So I just want to thank you all, because, you know, this gets me thinking about many things, and those issues that you raised are so important. And that's it.
Okay. Tony or Maritza, do you want to comment, or should we take other?
I think it would be great to open it up to the floor. I really appreciated Tony's invocation of nature without necessarily using that word, and so I think that was another important way in which part 2 and part 1 speak to each other in terms of the projects and the citations. But Tony brought up Escambron, and Escambron right now is facing activism, very visible, regular basis for drivers by, because of a major project that will endanger the public space behind the Normandy into a multi-story parking garage. So I just wanted to kind of you know, as we speak, places become less accessible, and I think that is now one of the biggest, perhaps, and most visible struggles in Puerto Rico. But I would like to open it up to the floor. But it's interesting to how they all speak to each other, and everybody's comments speak to each other.
Tony,
Can I be part of the floor?
Sure, it's your book.
I think at the same time that I said what I said towards the end of my intervention a little while ago, I think that there is absolutely no question that one of the most urgent needs, and I do think the book is responding to that need, but I find it everywhere in Puerto Rico, in artist and artistic work, not only in live arts work, but in video art, in the visual arts, in our literary productions. I see it everywhere, that we're all literally thrust to this need for the archive, and for the archive in the way that I tried to describe it a little while ago, and that I tried to describe it in the book, for the archive in an extremely ample sense that is closer, like Opal was saying, that is much closer to the lives we have made in this, when like Lisanne would say, when we make this our land in itself instead of the land beyond, when we made it for ourselves. It's much closer to all of those embodied experience of trying to make this land, which has been so systematically exploited and oppressed and made to be erased, like Tony was insisting. So all our efforts to reclaim the land, the land, by which I mean everything, right? Because the sea has made the land, and we are primarily volcanic creations. But in the present, in the contempt, so I think that is like a historical effort that is tied intrinsically to the colonial enslaved conditions that we were forced into. And the book tries to say that, but also, and at the same time, like I think Tony was insisting in his presentation, the present moment, there's such an absolute, like, se ha disparado, right? That need, that urgency to archive our lives and our experiences in all kinds of ways, precisely because the erasure is not really a threat. We cannot talk about the threat of erasure anymore. We are living as we speak, and that's what I think Tony and Maritza were insisting upon, and I totally agree. As we speak, we are being derrumbados. We're literally being calmed down, and it's really difficult to even talk about, because it's horrible to have to name this and to face this, but it is the moment we're living. And I think one of the ways in which we are trying to answer Tony's question about who do we are and what do we do as we are being erased, is precisely all of these efforts that I'm seeing everywhere in all our arts, in all our activism efforts, to say, aquí vive gente, you know, and this is, we are life and we are alive. So anyway, that is something I wanted to say.
Aquí vive gente e importamos.
Mhm.
That's so true, so true. Anyone else? Any other comment that we can share with Beatriz, with any of the presenters? Yes, I see hands here. Pierre, Angelique?
No, I'm just clapping.
Oh, this is a clapping. Oh, I'm sorry. I misinterpreted your hand. Good. Anyone else wants to jump into the conversation?
One of the things I think is, that really comes out strongly in the text, and that the text leads us into saying, is the way space and place, well, place is being remade in a different image always. And that marketing strategy is really silencing so much of the nuanced experiences of people. Aquí vive gente, por eso mismo, es the silencing of that nuance and the humanity, because we have reverted to a pre-human being that we understand was very pivotal to the understanding of inhuman or non-human of slavery. So this justified why slavery could happen. And now, oh, well, they don't really matter. And that's why I like what you just said. Because so they're not human, so it doesn't matter. They're less human than other people. They have less money, so no importa. So how you revalue value is a really important thing. When you look at the Marxist understanding of value and the value creation of life, and what Harvey talks about the commodification or the making of commodities, how do we stop that? How do we value ourselves in a way that is not laden with commercialized modification, so to speak, and making space for that to happen, because that is essential, the making of space, so that the identities that go up and that embody those spaces. I hope that makes sense.
That makes sense.
The
I would
book-
like
the book-
Beatriz to,
Yeah,
Beatriz
go
to
ahead.
tease out the whole notion of performance, right? So I think Tony and Martha says the book is a performance. Beatrice, in the work, you talk about Louisa and others who are performing. And I want to just, I want to make sure that we're understanding the nuance of what that means. What is the performance level that we each engage in on a daily basis, and how does the Caribbean performs for the metropolis?
Mhm.
Yes, thank you, Opal. I'm really glad to be asked that question. Well, I cry rather easily, you might have noticed, but when Maritza said the book itself is a performance, that I was on the verge of tears once again. And that's because to me, that is, the highest possible praise the book can get. I know that the word performance, and here in the context of Puerto Rico, people talk a lot, for instance, about that politics here is un circo, a circus. I am aware that these words, performing, performance, circus, it's a theater, es un teatro, es puro teatro, are used with a quite negative charge, right? They're meant to signify that it's a lie. It's it's a lie either in a kind of moral sense, or it's a lie in a kind of like, oh, it's been commodified by capital, basically, and it's something, performs to the interests of power, for instance. But I am deeply invested in using those concepts, which in general one might refer to as the live arts, las artes vivas, as exactly the opposite of this negative connotation that they sometimes have. I feel like part of what I'm saying about Betances, Capetillo, and Albizu Campos, the three of them in that first part of the book, part of what I'm trying to say, among other things, but a very important thing that I feel, in spite of the different ways in which they can be inserted in the Caribbean's intellectual and political history, and in spite of the vast differences in their biographies and also in their political work and in their ideologies, one of the things that they all have in common is what I think a performative understanding of politics. And by that I mean a defense of the importance of the body, of the live body, towards liberation in Puerto Rico and the Caribbean in general. In addition to the fact that I'm defending them as Caribbeanist thinkers, and rather than just Puerto Rican, right? So from live arts and performance, I get especially the defense of the body as a site, as an archival site that produces archive and also embodies it in ways that are not necessarily, of course, written ways, because they have to do with evocations, emotions, sight, smells, etc., etc., etc. And also then that's one of the ways in which, and I think this is also an answer to one of Maritza's questions, that's one of the ways in which I'm trying to say that the more contemporary activist and artistic work that I engage with in part 2 of the book is connected to this history through the body, because this is rather than explicitly people who are working in politics and having a performative understanding of that, which was part 1. And we can talk about Capetillo and the politics of dress, etc. I mean, I try to discuss several things about that in the first part, but the activist groups and initiatives and the artistic works that I discuss in part 2 are linked submarinely with the figures I was talking about in part 1 in ways that are sort of like the reverse. They have explicitly performative politics, or rather, I should say, political performances. So for instance, someone who is so important and central for the struggle in defense of nature in Puerto Rico in the most ample sense, Tito Kayak, is, and I saw here, and Carmen Haydée said hi to Lowell Feet, whom I should have also said hi to, and I'm so grateful that you're here. From Lowell Feet, I got actually the idea, with which I totally agree, that someone like Tito Kayak is a performer, and not only the way he's usually understood in Puerto Rico as an activist, right? He is, but this activism is explicitly performative. And I try to go through several ways in which that form of activism in him and Amigues del Mar is embodied and is Caribbeanist, and it has to do with water and what that, and the coast and what that generates. So yes, I think that I tried to sort of answer Opal's question, and also one of Maritza's most important questions that I have in my notes here.
Comments?
I wanted to I thought that spoke really well to what Opal was saying about this notion of hybridity not being atomized and being lived. And I think that's what Beatriz was just speaking to. And the word sovereignty, which is in the subtitle of the book, is suggested and as a everyday individual and collective. She used the word embodiment, a lived ongoing process. And so I thought that was really important. I think the way what Beatriz just said is linked to sovereignty, which of course Puerto Rico does not increasingly does not have, is really key. And just listening to Beatriz speak now helped me understand the relationship between the photos, because I didn't do that until now. The photos of part one, which, in which she's examining the performance of these figures, with the photos of part two, in which many times naked women, are engaging in public art. So yeah, that it really, listening to your answer, Beatriz, was very helpful.
I just wanted to quickly comment that I just noticed that people were writing on the chat, and Larry, muchas gracias, just put up the site where you can actually get the book, right? It's in the chat right now. And we will definitely order it for our own library system, hopefully for our Richardson seminar room as well. But for anyone interested, please look at the site on the chat.
About that, I would like to add that I've been told by the publisher that they might be publishing a soft cover version of the book next year, which I am hoping very much that will be much more accessible in terms of how much they charge for it, and also for people who would like to read it in Spanish, just for you to know that I am working on translating it. But then, everything is happening all the time at the same time as we speak, like Tony was saying. So translating it is also, and I have to, update this. And so it's a process, but I'm doing that. So thank you so much for the support. And I wanted to say something about what Maritza just said, and I did not write it down. Maybe I will remember it in a minute.
I have to leave in a little bit. So I just wanted to say that one of the areas that I think we need to focus more attention is the healing and the public art. And Tony, I think, mentioned that in his presentation, because we have not acknowledged in the Caribbean the trauma of being here. We have not really acknowledged the trauma that happened to the indigenous people, and then us being here and what that means. And I think that public art is a medium through which that kind of collective healing can and must take place. And I also want to add that it is imperative that as we think about connectivity, as we think about going forward, that we do not forget that healing is a prerequisite.
Yeah. Ancestral trauma, as well as the trauma is constant and ongoing and collective.
Right.
Absolutely.
I'm not
And
surprised.
accumulates.
Just talking
Accumulates
about
with
a
each.
And that,
Yeah.
I mean, that's something that you
It's-
see coming out or being articulated in so many different ways, especially in Puerto Rico, because Puerto Rico there's such a large artistic community that is constantly producing, not formally, informally, and that informal production is as important as we've been talking about in terms of the archive. How we capture that, now that's the challenge. You know, like in teatro and thing, how do you move theater but still keep it, still hold on to it, like still have it be tangible in the future, or is
And
it simply enough?
And I think before Opal has to leave, I want to say something in response to something she said in her presentation about the challenge of multilingualism for all of us, but also in connection with this question of public art. I think also the challenge, I mean, one of my main desires for this book is to say that the forms of lived sovereignty that Maritza was referring to, that we have had historically and that we live and produce today as we speak, have to be Caribbeanist. And that means too, that we have to keep coming up with ways, and we've been doing this. I want to thank especially initiatives associated, for instance, with Annalie Davis, the artist from Barbados. That's how I met Tony, actually. I met Opal through her interviewing the Caribbean Journal. I mean, all of the ways in which we can creatively produce ways to come together across our islands is essential. Mm-hmm. And it's perhaps the challenge is as huge as the erasure challenge that we were discussing a while ago, not only because of the of languages, but also because of sheer like transportation. I mean, if I want to go to Opal, I have to pay a ridiculous amount of money for a ticket and go to Miami, and then
exactly
hopping.
I mean, we have to, I mean, I really do think when Tito Kayak got in his kayak, I mean, we do have to like start thinking about producing literally our own collective sovereign ships. I mean, I know this is like, I'm sure the US Army will get on us immediately, but you know, just saying, just naming a desire that we do have to keep coming up with however many ways we can of coming together, because from the perspective of Puerto Rico, I have to say, we in so many ways live as though we are not part of the region we are part of. And so I just wanted to stress that and thank Opal again and I'm so grateful not only for today, but for just being in the world with you and getting to know you. Thank you.
Thank you. And one final closing remark is about just that, because since COVID, our ability to connect geographically has become even more difficult and even more expensive. So, you know, what are the canoes that we're building to ensure that we are not talking over this device, but that we're in fact connecting with each other in a meaningful way. So I want to thank you all. I want to thank you for this amazing book that will, you know, is giving us so much to think about and so much to talk about, and that it certainly deserves to have another space and many other spaces for this kind of discourse. Thank you. And it's good to see you, Tony and Martha and Carmen, even though I'm just seeing you through the virtual.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Opal. Thank you for your intervention.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye. Can I jump in for a second? Or I wanted to follow up with something Bea just said, because the sea, as much as we want to talk about kayaks, and we all need to learn to swim. So many of us don't know how to swim and we live in the Caribbean. We are surrounded by water, but we are terrified of the water because of that trauma that has never been addressed. And we have the relationship is ajeno con el agua. So we have to figure out ways to bring swimming or a better relation to the water itself into our beings. I don't know if that makes sense.
Well, and class privilege and swimming pools. The lack of access to swimming pools due to underprivilege is, I think, central to that problem.
And that's one of the big things that I think really changed my way of thinking about space in Escambron, because we had all those things there. At least when I was younger, they were there. They were accessible, and that access has just been eroded over time, so that there's a generation who doesn't even know that they were there, who has no relationship with the space in the ways we do, I guess. Just like the Plaza Universitaria, that blows my mind sometimes, that people have no concept of the university without that problematic space.
Yeah, it doesn't. People don't even know why it's problematic. The newer generation.
In the first place.
Yeah.
There are students in here. There are students also in the crowd. Lisette, did you want to say something? I saw your mic up, or other students.
Si fuera posible, yo sé que estamos ya casi sobre la hora. Sencillamente agradecer haber participado de una espléndida presentación con unas perspectivas riquísimas. Quisiera traer un elefante blanco que anda por acá, sencillamente como una manera de honrar las condiciones materiales en las que Beatriz ha trabajado este proyecto, y que son signos de una cantidad cada vez mayor de colegas extraordinarias y extraordinarios que no tienen las condiciones mínimas para hacer este tipo de proyectos. Entonces, la destrucción, la ruina, la erosión que se ha comentado respecto a nuestras costas, se ve palpable en la Universidad de Puerto Rico. Es una manera de traer un bache de agua a una celebración, pero me parece importante destacar que si bien podemos celebrar que Beatriz lo logró, es importante recordar que ella es producto de la universidad y que necesitamos rescatar ese proyecto, otro proyecto, para que puedan seguirse reproduciendo estas reflexiones. Así que un comentario.
Importantísimo tu comentario, Lisette. Esencial, importantísimo.
Y representa la exclusión de una generación o dos completos de intelectuales puertorriqueños de la Universidad de Puerto Rico. Y una de mis preguntas que mencionó la academia post-tenure, sin tirar la toalla y sin los brazos caídos, está reconociendo este trabajo en estas forzadas situaciones precarias. Yo creo que es muy importante lo que dijiste y muy importante reconocerlo. Una cosa que casi me sorprendió de terminar el libro es que termina en un pensamiento muy esperanzador. No sé, lo dejo ahí. Termina el libro de manera esperanzadora. Eso es importante también, pero no lo digo como de la nada. Y ella tampoco termina, el libro no lo dice de la nada tampoco. So that very idea that the work is being done in spite of and because of these, right, the current climate, and the ethical imperative and the commitment that suggests, yo creo que es muy importante recalcar.
It speaks to the story of all our lives, I think. las personas que vivimos en Puerto Rico y en el Caribe, en las islas del Caribe. It speaks to that. Esa esperanza, aún en medio de lo que justamente trae Lisette, right? Y cómo nosotros nos envolvemos en mejorar esta situación, ¿verdad? En posibles alternativas para mejorar la situación. Anyone else? Any last minute question? We have about, I think, 2 more minutes till 4.
I want to say thank you to Lowell and Maria Cristina.
Sí, que están por aquí. Where are they? I just saw their names, but míralos, yay! Mentors, friends, founding father and mother of the doctoral program. Y mira que muchas generaciones de colegas y estudiantes han influenciado. All kudos to you. Gracias, gracias. Anyone else? Last words? Lowell, you want to say something?
Ok, pues yo realmente trato de no estar en discusiones públicas así, pero que me alegro mucho que Beatriz ha hecho los comentarios sobre Tito Kayak y la noción de performance y lo que más y más en América Latina estamos llevando en vez de performance, teatralidades dentro de la vida, que teatralidades vivas dentro de comunidades, dentro de la población local y la importancia en el desarrollo de las culturas locales. Yo creo que eso es muy, muy importante. Gracias, Beatriz. Okay.
El agradecimiento es mío, Lowell, que además es una figura, bueno, no solamente todos los reconocimientos que ya les hemos dado a ustedes, pero Lowell además es una de las figuras más importantes precisamente en el estudio de las formas múltiples de teatros puertorriqueños, uno de sus más importantes críticos, historiadores y archivistas, sin cuyo trabajo realmente nada de lo que aparece en este libro hubiese sido posible, literalmente. Así que es un enorme honor tenerle aquí hoy. Muchas gracias.
Al revés. Agradecido para estar aquí. Gracias.
Okay, I think this is unfortunately it, right? We could probably keep talking for hours and hours, and we'll most likely have another presentation sometime soon en presencia, right? Tal vez en el recinto o en Mayagüez. Tenemos que juntarnos presencialmente y estrecharnos y abrazarnos. Beatriz, gracias por tu trabajo, por tu generosidad, por invitarnos a ser parte de este momento especial en tu vida. Gracias mil.
Gracias a ti, Carmen Haydée. Gracias a ti, Carmen Haydée. Gracias a todo el mundo que está aquí hoy, y otra vez a Tony, a Maritza y a Opal. Y otro saludito que acabo de ver el nombre de Alejandra Martorell aquí, otra grande de nuestras artes vivas. Y muchísimas gracias por estar. Y bueno, pues ojalá que sí, que nos podamos estrechar muy pronto, que sea literalmente vivo el encuentro fuera de estas pantallitas, y que lo podamos hacer no solo en nuestras islas de Boriquén, pero en más islas nuestras que son también nuestras, eso mismo. Gracias otra vez, y gracias Bruje y Anaís.
Yay, for the work you do.
Qué
increíble.
Generoso y importante trabajo, esencial.
Sí,
muchísimas gracias. Gracias a las personas que están escribiendo en el chat también. Un abrazo muy, muy grande a todo el mundo. Sí, ok, estaba leyendo los mensajes. Gracias.
Okay, the recording stopped, but thank you so much. Qué maravilloso junte.
Estoy muy conmovida.
Thank you.
Sí.
Muchas gracias.
Beatriz.
Wow,
You
entonces
should
vamos a
feel so proud. You should feel so proud.
sí, I feel
Hay que enseñar